Happy Philippine Environment Month. My name is Andy. We are live on our Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. Welcome to Conversation on Conservation, where we explore eagle research and conservation in the international arena to help us discover a way forward for the Philippine eagle survival in the 21st century. We began the conversations during the Philippine Eagle Week and learned a lot in our discussions with local and international experts. Tonight, we're giving you a bonus surprise episode of our Conversation on Conservation Philippine Eagle Week Edition. We thank our partners San Roque Power Corporation and Omnipay Incorporated for co-presenting the Philippine Eagle Week with us, together with PLDT, Oticon Builders Incorporated, and Energy Development Corporation with the support of FDC Utilities Incorporated. Joining me is our Director for Research and Conservation, Dr. Jason Ibanez. Hi, you're on mute.
Sorry for that, Andy. Again, hi and a pleasant evening to everyone.
Yes.
I can't believe that we're now on our fourth episode, Andy.
Oh, we are back sooner than we expected.
Right, yeah. And hopefully this is
Yeah.
not our last.
Yes, definitely. And I'm glad that we're able to squeeze this in this month, right?
Right. In celebration of course, Philippine Environment Month.
Yes. So maybe you can give us an overview of what we've talked about so far.
Well, certainly, Andy. During our first episode within the Philippine Eagle Week, we look at the status of Philippine eagles and discuss that sadly, it seems, the pandemic did not stop some Filipinos from shooting and trapping our national bird. Then we moved on to a two-part dialogue with raptor conservation experts from abroad. We chatted with Dr. Chris McClure of the Peregrine Fund and learned that the Philippines ranked ninth for the highest number of threatened raptors in the world. We're on top 10 for the greatest number of raptors that are endangered. For Philippine eagles, Chris also recommended getting an accurate estimate of numbers in the wild as research priorities and what amount of suitable forest habitat remains. He also recommended studying surplus or non-territorial eagles. Now, maybe our audience isn't aware that apart from the paired adults and the young birds, we also have what we call floaters or surplus birds that are hanging around, waiting for a territory to become vacant, and they form a very important part of the population.
So sila ba yung parang mga singles, ganon?
Exactly, mga bachelors and bachelorettes, ika nga, trying to
Hindi pa nagsettle
wait.
down.
Hindi pa nagsettle down, waiting for their sexual maturity and pair up eventually. So again, according to Chris, it's also important to measure and identify what amount of the population is composed of surplus birds. And then, of course, Professor Stephen Garnett of Charles Darwin University also joined us in another episode. And he talked about the different cultural knowledge and worldviews of indigenous peoples, and that we need to maintain a respectful and inclusive approach when working with them for conservation, so especially since majority of the remaining habitats in the Philippines are within ancestral domains. We also had Attorney Jose Andres Canivel of Forest Foundation Philippines, who also shared his insights on IP engagement in conservation. And he emphasized the need to develop clear metrics or measures that will identify the impacts of indigenous people engagement to both biodiversity as well as indigenous well-being. So we really got a lot now from this conversation, as you would agree.
Yes, and I look forward to learning more, especially to tonight's episode. So without further ado, from US and Australia, we now move to the UK. Joining us tonight is the Eagle Reintroduction Wales founder and project manager. She is a raptor biologist that has over 10 years experience working with wild injured, and rehabilitated owls and raptors. Let's welcome to the conversation Dr. Sophie-Lee WIlliams.
Hello, Andy, Jason, and everyone. Thank you very
Hi.
much for inviting me to be part of conservation. Oh, well, conversations on conv- conservation, which is really difficult to say, by the way. And happy
it's, a,
Philippine Environment Month as well. Yeah.
it's a tongue twister. We're very happy to have you, Sophie. It's a pleasure. Um,
Thank you for joining us.
No
and
worries.
yeah. Okay, so I guess let's now move on into the conversation. Sophie, could you tell us about the Eagle Reintroduction Wales project? No, I know that this is a project that's really close to your heart. Could you tell us about its origins or what inspired it and where it is right now?
Yes, of course. So, Eagle Reintroduction Wales, or ERW for short, is really a project designed by myself to restore our two native lost eagles. And we have two native eagles to Wales and across Britain, the golden eagle and the white-tailed eagle, in the Welsh language known as Eryri Môr for white-tailed eagles, and Eryri Urad for golden eagles. And the project really was designed back in 2016 when I was working with these birds in Scotland and being mentored by global raptor expert Roy Dennis. So really the idea come over a cup of tea. It was over a cup of tea, and Eagle Reintroductions have been suggested for Wales, which is where I'm from, for many decades. But so far, up until now, no action has been taken. So when I left Scotland and left these magnificent birds, I come back to Wales and designed a feasibility study to tackle the challenges and limitations really here to restore these wonderful birds. Um, so, and the reintroduction process is really comprehensive process. So we are 70% complete at the minute. So we've spent
Wow.
3 years gathering crucial scientific evidence, shaped around criteria for authority figures, Welsh Government, NRW here as well, and in accordance to the Iucn criteria. And this is the inspiration behind this is obviously working with Roy and his experience in Britain and across Europe, reintroducing birds of prey and eagles. But eagle reintroductions now have been a traditional method since the 1975 year in Britain, when they were first released in Scotland. And golden eagles are a much more novel process of reintroduction, but they started in 2001 2003 across Britain.
Mhm.
So it's really our goals to replicate the success of these projects, and they're extremely important because they contribute, reintroductions contribute to the international status of these birds, right across the globe. So at the minute we are 70% complete with our license. We're now hoping to go into the most challenging step of the reintroductions, that is public and stakeholder engagement. So we're really now hoping to bring stakeholders and the public on board to address their concerns, attitudes and perceptions of these species.
Well, that's really good news, Sophie. I'm happy to hear that reintroduction appears to be an acceptable option as justified by your study, and so congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, you mentioned the two native eagles which were lost in Wales, no, the golden eagle and the white-tailed sea eagle. Could you tell us a bit more about their biology, the biology of these two birds, and why they were lost in Wales?
Of course. And yeah, so I'll start with, these both species are very different, of course. We've got the white-tailed seagull, which is more of a coastal bird. They like coastal areas, they're associated to marine waters and fresh waters as well. And they normally nest on cliffs and mature trees. So they're really general species. They have wide habitat preferences and prey availability. They eat fish, for example, seabirds, waterfowl, and also switch as well in the winter to carrion and small mammals and medium-sized mammals. So they've got a very varied diet. And then we've got golden eagles in Wales, which mostly associated upland habitats, moorlands, peat bogs, so they normally, go for ground dwelling species, game birds, for example, pheasants, red grouse, rabbits and hares is also an important part of their diet. And also, they are keen scavengers all year round as well. They're top of the food chain, so they do like free food. um the reason really why they become extinct in Wales is because there was wide scale bounty payments for these species right across Britain, right across Europe, and obviously played a big part in their extinction. So they become extinct in Wales during the 1850s, which is now over 150 years ago, of course. And the Welsh landscape's changed significantly since then. So this is why these studies are really important. But the conflict was over that, it's recorded in historic literature, that there was a conflict between the understanding of these species taking fully grown sheep and lambs, for example. So with these bounty payments, they were getting paid to do egg collecting, persecution, and it completely wiped out our breeding birds by the 18th century. But then still we were getting youngsters coming down from populations up in Scotland and across England, but they were still being persecuted until there was no eagles left. And this was generally, a accepted practice back in them days, because we found evidence of, if birds were being killed on estates or on private lands, it was actually broadcast in the newspapers of, where these birds were shot, who shot them, what date, what species. So we had really comprehensive picture of why they become eliminated. And obviously, because it was human mediated, we strongly believe that we have a moral duty to restore them. And the reason why eagle reintroductions are so important is because they have very slow biological traits, for example. So the biology of these birds, like your Philippine eagle, for example,
Yes.
they've got long lifespans. They're case-selected species. They've got slow sexual maturity. They've got high mortalities as well in their first 2 years of life. And one of the most important reasons why reintroductions of eagles is an important conservation strategy is because both species, white-tailed and golden eagles, have a biological trait called natal philopatry, which means that they have a strong commitment to their birthplaces, so their natal areas. So when they sexually mature at the age of 5 and enter the breeding population, they will breed in close proximity to their birthplace, normally around 11 to 26 kilometers. That means that the population growth is quite slow. So for example, it's taken 50 years to establish 130 breeding pairs in Scotland. That's a very slow turnaround. So this is why these birds are suffering and not recolonizing their historic ranges. So what we've also found here in Britain is that by creating artificial release sites, actually creates artificial native areas. So when we release these species in Wales, they will then have a commitment to that area. So we're really using it to establish a new breeding population to recolonize their historic ranges. So that's why it's important really for a conservation strategy here.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, that's the extinction of the native eagles is really sad, Sophie. I can't help but
Yeah.
think of the case of our national bird. We
Similar.
talked about this. Yeah. The species is also facing similar human persecution. Just like your farmers in the olden times, um, some farmers now they still believe that eagles kill pigs, goats, and other livestock, and they shoot and trap them for that belief. And it's
Yeah.
still happening. And apparently, the pandemic didn't stop people from shooting and trapping our Philippine eagles. No, we had a very interesting conversation also with Chris from the Peregrine Fund about African vultures. And
Mhm.
these birds are experiencing what they call retaliatory poisoning. Locals poisoning the raptors. And after hearing that, we came up with retaliatory trapping or shooting.
Mhm.
For our case here among Philippine eagles. And I just hope that we don't get at that point of losing our national bird due to these
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
wasteful
that,
actions.
the conflict with predators these days and the perception
Yeah.
towards these predators, we most have got a very negative attitude, but these landowners are custodians of our land. It's the same in the Philippines, or the same in Wales and across Britain, across Europe, across the globe. They are, really the hands of life, of our nature, and it's
True,
really
true.
important that they have a connection to these birds, and a positive connection, because obviously they can have a big influence on skewing that population structure and the population demographics. For example, in Scotland, we've got a skewed age structure. For example, our youngsters, our young eagles, like you mentioned at the start, your floater birds,
Mm,
up in
Mhm.
Scotland are the highest risk of getting persecuted, which
mm.
means then there's obviously concerns for imminent decline, because these are the next recruits of our breeding population in a few years' time. So it's it's a sad reality, really, but working with landowners is very exciting opportunity as well, to start working with people and working and understanding and teaching about the
Yeah.
behavior of these birds. They're
Yes.
not vicious predators at all. They
Right.
they're harmless species in many
Mm,
ways.
mm, mm.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I'm
Interesting.
actually, just hearing your stories, it makes me realize that, raptors are really probably one of the most misunderstood,
Exactly. Yeah,
species, right?
totally
By
agree.
humans. Like, same with the Philippine eagle. And I think when you mentioned about the importance of the landowners and involvement, like, maybe probably they would be the most important stakeholders as well in this initiative. I wonder though, because you mentioned before it was widely accepted, right? When they hunt, um, because they try to protect the sheep, the animals. So when did it? When did the turnaround happen? Like, when did the movement start to say enough? We can't keep doing this to this species.
Yeah, that's a good question, really. I think it's the protection measures. We've got Wildlife and Countryside Act. I think it was 1981, I think, off the top of my head, where these protections started coming in for the species. And, one of our assessments for the Eagle Reintroduction Wales project, and obviously for our Iucn criteria, is not only why did these birds become extinct, but has the cause of extinction now been
Mm,
eliminated or decreased, for example.
Mhm.
And I think it was that protection measure and the change in attitudes, really, in the
Right.
20th century, that has helped our birds of prey population. Because we found evidence in Wales, by looking at ecologically similar species, so other birds of prey across the Welsh landscape. We've got the likes of red kite, which is our national bird. They're doing
Mhm.
extraordinarily well across the Welsh landscape at the minute. We've got our common buzzards, which are also in high numbers. Even our specialist birds like our peregrine falcons, our hen harriers, our ospreys are also naturally recolonizing and expanding populations. So, this is, so attitudes are changing here in
Yeah.
right.
Wales
Yeah.
towards our birds of prey. It still happens, persecution still happens across
Okay.
Wales, but a very small percentage compared to England and Scotland, because we've got a very different land use. Most of our land use is allocated to livestock farming.
Yes.
Um, rather than driven grouse shoots or driven pheasant shoots, for example. So we've and I think in Wales we are really proud of our bird of prey populations. But there are still landowners that we would have to work with, because it's still that risk that these big species are coming back, and there could be a negative attitude towards them because of their concerns around land predation, for example, or pheasant predation, obviously, because so we've still got to work on the ground with those concerns.
Wow.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you for telling us about that, Sophie. I also wanted to ask because you mentioned that you follow the IUCN guidelines for reintroduction. So we were wondering, if you could tell us more about the key components of the guidelines and what you've done so far to satisfy each of the components.
Yes, of course. So most people think that reintroduction processes are really simple. So we can just click our fingers and reintroduce these species free willy-nilly across the landscape. But that's not the case because reintroductions are a really strict and highly regulated licensing process. So in the case for whales, we have to first gather evidence of, whether it's acceptable for the species, but also for whales as well in itself. So we have to work with authority figures to provide evidence, of the feasibilities. And the feasibility studies are really, really comprehensive. So they're split up into a number of different reports. the first the first report really is on the biological feasibility, which looks at the biology of the species. What are their abiotic and biotic factors, their nesting preferences, their habitat preferences, their prey species. We also have a look at why, for example, they become extinct, and has those causes become eliminated is also
Mhm.
part of that biological feasibility. Where we're sourcing our birds from is also another criteria. And are we going to damage that source population by taking these birds out? That's all the evidence that needs to be provided in the report. So that's
Mhm.
really the questions on whether it's the most acceptable option for the species is around the biology, how we can contribute to the conservation. Is there
Right.
just a reason why we're doing this? And obviously I've explained because of the natal philopatry, that's why it's important for eagles. And the second report is about environmental feasibility. So is your release environment still suitable to restore these birds? So this report really looks on how much suitable habitat is available for these species, how many nest sites are available, also land use compatibility as well. There are a number of modern landscape features now across the globe that these species never used to, tackle or deal with back in historic times. Wind farms is a big one. Commercial conifer forestries is also another big one in Wales that's changed that open landscape to really dense canopy forested habitat, which also
Mhm.
has an influence on eagle prey and the ability to nest and hunt. So all of these factors need to be taken into
Right.
consideration. Another assessment then is, which is where we're at the minute, is the socio-economic
Mhm.
feasibilities. So this is looking at whether reintroduction is the most acceptable option and fit into current social and economic infrastructures. So that's a very big step in the IUCN criteria. And
Yeah.
then, to finalize everything, we need a risk assessment. So a risk assessment on the ecological risks that these species can bring, and the benefits. It's not always about the risk, it's also about the benefits as well. We look at disease risk, we have a look at environmental risks and mortality risks as well. So they're really comprehensive studies. And like I
Wow.
mentioned, within Wales, we've
Yeah.
tackled 70% of this. The
Mhm.
next step for us is just the socioeconomic feasibility
Perfect.
studies, on the public perceptions and stakeholder
Wow.
perceptions.
That's a vast groundwork you need to establish before doing the actual reintroduction. Do you
Yeah,
Yes.
and
think we're
especially,
ready? Do you think we're ready for that, Sir Jay? That's a lot of work, but
well,
Yeah.
we'll
I
get to
totally
it.
agree with Sophie that the socioeconomic feasibility would be, one of the major component
Yeah.
of the work, especially since
Yeah.
Mhm.
we're dealing with human behavior as well as
Yes.
values. But of course, there's a science to making this work, and we definitely can learn a lot from Sophie's experience.
Yeah.
Uh, so, how close are you from completing the FS? You mentioned it's 70%, and
Yeah.
the rest would be the socio-economic feasibility. What's the timeline for this, Sophie?
Well, we're hoping. So with golden eagles, we're a bit more reserved, I think, at the minute to whitetail seagulls because our research, we're looking at the right conservation strategies to restore golden eagles. Our upland habitat in Wales, we're quite conscious that they've been historically grazed. So,
Mm.
where the upland habitat condition and prey density are not on par with what we'd like. So we'd like to work on habitat restorations and a conservation strategy with stakeholders across Wales. So we hopefully will be restoring golden eagles in due course, but a very small population, maybe a trial period initially. And then the most exciting part really is that we now know that we can confirm that whitetail seagull reintroductions in Wales is an acceptable option for the species and for the
Whoa, that's good.
environment. So we're hoping that to launch
Yeah.
public and stakeholder engagement now by the
Mhm.
winter, and hopefully we can get these birds restored by the summer of 2023. So 2-year time frame for whitetail seagulls, which is exciting. Fingers crossed. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
Yeah.
we're very, very happy to hear that progress, Sophie, and
Yes, it's amazing progress.
certainly we're learning a lot from your experiences. We're really happy that we're doing this. Okay, so Andy, I think at this juncture we
I
are
actually have
pleased.
one more
Or you have another
question.
question?
Yeah,
Sorry,
I'm
go ahead, Andy.
interested about the public and stakeholder engagement. Like, how do you do that with this project? And also, is the public there receptive to this method?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we've been doing light public engagement over the last couple of years. So we've used, because what we've done is our scientific evidence provides visual aids to show people what the feasibility. So we've worked hard on providing evidence that we can work with the public. So we've been doing, and stakeholders, of course. So we've got visual evidence to take to our meetings and our stakeholder and our public events, so people can
Mm-hmm.
actually see this and kind of relate to it rather than just us speaking about it. So that's really helped us
Yeah.
out um, over the last couple of years. But the way that we launched the official feasibility, the socio-economic feasibility studies, is we'll start doing. So we need to select a release site. So we've done that for whitetail seagulls. We've selected the Pembrokeshire coast. So we'll start working on the ground now, looking for a release site, working, doing drop-in sessions with the public, doing stakeholder
Right.
interviews as well.
Mhm.
So really, most of our focus is in Pembrokeshire. So on the ground in Pembrokeshire, we would be, gathering evidence by surveys, for example, questionnaires as well, and
Mm-hmm.
direct interviews and drop-in sessions. And then we also need a national approach. So, like I said, we'll be launching
Mhm.
questionnaires and surveys then to try to capture the national stance towards this as
Yeah.
well. And
Right.
that what that information will do is it will highlight areas that are in support and areas that potentially need more work. And then we would,
Mm-hmm.
that would then help us or guide us in the right direction. Um, so yeah, that's how we would approach it.
Yeah,
Interesting.
I like the strategy of
Mm.
doing a local approach, but then also
Yeah.
fortifying it
Still
with a
consider like
national
the
approach. Yeah.
bigger, yeah, the
Yeah,
bigger
because these
audience.
these birds are really nomadic in their first
Mm.
5 years of life. They they explore they would explore Wales. So, as it doesn't make sense for us just to do public engagement and stakeholder engagement in Pembrokeshire, because even though that would be the central breeding hub for
Mm.
whitetail
Mhm.
seagulls, in the first couple of years they will be adventuring around Wales. So we need to make sure that there is, acceptance to this, because it's the welfare of these birds which is the most important. We don't want to be repeating history, of course.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure that we've got the right public and stakeholder attitude in place here before we
Yeah.
release these birds. So it's a big step for us. But fingers
All the
crossed,
best. Yes.
it will go well. It will go
I
well.
mean,
Yeah,
it's really about
that's really a
attitudes. Yeah.
great initiative, and thanks for that, Sophie. So again, at this juncture, we are pleased to introduce one of our trusted partners from UK joining us tonight. as our reactor. And it's my pleasure to introduce him. Our reactor is the Chief Executive Officer of Raptor Aid, a UK-based charity for raptors. He is also a Philippine Eagle Conservation Champion who just recently hosted a crowdfunding initiative for the benefit of eagle conservation via GoFundMe. Ladies and gentlemen, we have Mr. Jimmi Hill. Hi, Jimmy.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me.
Hi, Jimmy.
Hi, Jimmy.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Well, thanks for joining us, Jimmy. Let me share to the audience that Jimmy actually has visited the Philippines. I think twice already, right?
Yeah, I've got the
Right.
T-shirt as well.
And look at the shirt, no? I think that shirt came from me, Jimmy. And we're very happy to have you join us in some of our field sites, including nesting sites. So, with what you know about the challenges that the Philippine Eagle faces here in the country, do you see reintroductions as a possible conservation option for a national bird, based on your own personal assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. Because one of the things that I've always been really impressed with the both times, but especially the second trip that I made out to the Philippines when we were out in the field with that community is just how good the foundation is, but also the communities are at buying into protecting the Philippine eagle. Just a little bit of knowledge and information. They really take the work that you do to heart. So I think in that sense, in terms of the reintroduction of eagles, I can only see it being a really positive thing. And I suppose you see it already with the rehabilitated birds, the birds that come into the centre, and then you take them back out to these communities and release them, and the excitement and the passion that people get behind just something as simple as releasing a rehabilitated bird. So I can only see it being a real positive for the conservation of the Philippine eagle.
Well, thanks for that, Jimmy. And it's really heartwarming to know that you think that reintroduction can work for the Philippine Eagles. And we're looking forward to having you again next year, and perhaps also Sophie, if she has the time and
Yeah, Sophie,
circumstances for
come
meeting.
over.
I'd love
But I think
that. I'd
Sophie's
love
gonna be
it.
so busy.
Yeah, that's true. I'll have to let you know how busy I am next year. Yeah, that's true. But
Yeah, she was.
I've got a question. I mentioned about the the age, the skewing age structure in Britain with our young eagles being more of a victim to persecution. Is that something that you're experiencing in the Philippines? Do you think the younger eagles are
Yeah.
more at risk of persecution because of their wider flights?
Yeah, that's really true. No, if
Mhm.
you look at our data for admissions at the Philippine Eagle Center, since we started during the 1970s, we had 89 Philippine Eagle admissions, rescued and rehabilitated. And actually, more than 80% of these are immature birds, from ages less than a year old up to 5 years old. So we think that in terms of vulnerability, the surplus or immature birds are vulnerable. But then
Yeah.
again, we also had some data for our breeding birds that once an adult Philippine eagle dies, so we put GPS tags on them. Once an adult Philippine eagle dies, the mate can easily replace them, can find
Okay.
a quick replacement.
A recruit.
They can
So
Yeah.
move on right away.
yeah,
That's
so
good
you
news. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. So you would assume that there are also a number of floaters still waiting for an adult eagle to die and then get replaced.
Mhm.
So we have these two data, and but again, we're as part of, as you mentioned earlier, part of the feasibility would be looking at this data set as well, and we're quite excited to analyze it further and then use it perhaps to justify a reintroduction in a particular island where we think that that it has been done
Yeah.
already.
It's interesting. Where do you think you would be able to source your birds from? If you were, would it be captive? They would be captive bred birds, for example, or they would be wild birds.
Sure.
It's
Yeah, a
interesting.
combination maybe.
Yeah.
Although as of now, we're still trying to refine our breeding techniques. But based on the data for Mindanao, so I'm talking about the Mindanao Island, where we think
Mm-hmm.
majority or more than 50% of the remaining Philippine eagle population is found. So that's more than 200 pairs.
Okay.
We think Mindanao would be a source, and
Yeah.
it's if you look at the biogeographic history of Leyte Island, which we think is vacant, and Mindanao, as well as another island which is Samar, they form a big island during the ice ages. So we think that there's gene flow between this
Okay.
population.
Interesting.
That's
Yeah.
about yeah. So again, but these are all like bits and pieces of information that we need to put together.
Yeah.
And I'm quite excited about Andy and I is quite excited about this conversation because this would definitely put us in the right track through your experiences, Sophie.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I'm
Yeah.
excited about it. I definitely, I definitely help out with the helping you with the evidence for this because I think a reintroduction, for eagles, like I said, is so important because they do suffer a lot, and if they were abundant, then we would see that those native behaviors again. So, for example, white-tailed eagles were extinct in South England for over 200, 150 years, exactly the same
Mm-hmm.
situation that we're experiencing in Wales. As soon as 6 birds, youngsters, were released in South England, it sparked not in European or continental movements of birds coming over. So we had four, and we've had four. I think one was Swedish as well. So we've, that 1 year and those 6 birds just sparked continental movements of white-tailed
wow.
seagulls from Europe.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
these small little
That's amazing.
efforts really help connect, the bigger picture. So,
Right.
Yeah.
yeah, it's
True.
exciting.
And
I'm
also,
curious.
oh yes,
Yeah.
Andy, go ahead.
I was just curious how, because you've been saying, Sir JD, but we haven't seen any eagles in Leyte for years now. Although there are accounts that there were sightings there in the past. How will it affect our translocation later on? If, say, for example, we find the nest there, or we find a pair or a few surplus birds in the area, will that still be a feasible area
I
for
don't,
really?
I
Well,
think, yeah, I think it's the justification of the biology. So if you've got, surplus birds there, then it depends on whether they've got that commitment to their natal areas, like golden and white-tailed seagulls. They might have
Mhm.
youngsters using it they as temporary settlement areas, they're called, for when youngsters use an area or forage or roost in an area. And normally for eagles, especially, imperial eagles and Bonelli's eagles, golden white-tailed eagles, most eagle species I'm aware of, they have between 6 and 7 temporary settlement areas that they
mm,
actually, rotate between over those 5 years. So it doesn't really necessarily mean that they breed there because they're
mm,
attractive to their natal areas. So it's the biology and the
Mhm.
justification around it. If you did have a
Mhm.
nesting pair in that historic area, you could go,
Yeah.
instead of going for a reintroduction, you could go for a top up. So, reinstating that population,
mm,
making sure that that breeding population expands. So there's a number of different conservation strategies that you can
Right.
use, on par with the information you have of that region. So there's many ways that we're able to put that evidence on in a report, really, or on paper.
Yeah.
yeah.
Anything, Sergio, you'd like to add?
Well,
Before we
I
finish?
totally agree. Let me also share that releases are also with the rehabilitation and release that we're doing. Once we
Mm-hmm.
release the eagles, because of the resources fueled into it, public attention. It's a very charismatic event. People like getting involved with releases, and then there's funds allotted to it, and then we get the chance to find more birds on the place because we're there watching the release bird,
Yes.
monitoring it, and that's when we discover additional birds, no, previously undiscovered birds in a particular area. In one particular area, for example, where we release a bird, we saw three surplus birds, feeding on the food provision, the supplemental food
For
that
the
we have been
released
giving to the
eagle. Yeah.
young. And we never realized that there could be three surplus birds in just one particular area. But it's
Yeah.
in the boundary of two
Yeah.
territories.
Okay.
I just remembered, Jimmy was able to visit a Philippine eagle nesting site at Mount Apo.
Wow.
Um, well, Jimmy, could you share what are your thoughts about that particular nesting site when you saw it, like, and especially with the role of communities in protecting this pair.
Yeah, so I mean, it was I suppose based on the previous the visit that I had, where we visited a similar nest site, but unfortunately we didn't see an active nest. That gave me an introduction or a taste of how you're involved with the communities, and then to go back and actually see an active nest, and obviously it was part of a community where these people have to live off the land, so they're actively having to live alongside the eagles. So it was a real privilege, not just to see the nest and the young eagle chick in the nest with the adults, but also to see the sort of responsibility that the community had taken on, and the role that it played in protecting this nest site. I mean, obviously, I spend a lot of time out in the field monitoring eagles and other birds of prey. So the fact that, I mean, it was incredible to see that one of the villagers had even managed to find this nest in such a remote part. Of course, we know Philippine eagles are one of the largest eagles in the world, but that doesn't by no means means they're easy to find and locate.
Yes.
So to see that alone was incredible. But yeah, the community, I was really impressed to see how well the community worked alongside the eagles, but also with the foundation. And I was just going to touch on when you were talking then, one of the things that I think is really vital with a reintroduction of any big charismatic species is the sort of trickle down effect that it has. So you're not just protecting. I've always told people this here in the UK when I talk about the Philippine Eagle Foundation, you're not just obviously protecting your national bird and this incredibly charismatic eagle. It has a huge sort of trickle down effect on the overall environment as well. So,
Right.
being an apex predator, it's at the top of the food chain. And so the forest, the tree planting, the work that you do with these communities to enhance and protect the environment is critical, especially, one of the terms, what climate change is, is on every piece of press release now, which is great. But this biodiversity loss that we have across the globe, whether it's in Wales or the Philippines, so there's that impact. And I think that's really important to get across to people that, yeah, we're focused on white-tailed eagles, golden eagles, or Philippine eagles in the Philippines, but it has such a huge sort of trickle and sort of effect on other species and the environment. It's a win-win, really, at the end of the day.
Yeah, and just expanding on what Jimmy said, that's one of our approaches here in Wales as well. It's not just a species reintroduction, but these species have a wider environmental benefit. They're linked to trophic cascades, like Jimmy mentioned. They have wider benefits. They're linked to healthier biodiversity, healthier prey populations, and if you get healthier prey populations, you get healthier vegetation structures, for example. So that they do have and they really do fit in, and it probably would be the case in the Philippines. They really do fit into government objectives at the minute of climate change and biodiversity crisis, and emergencies, and they're umbrella species, so by protecting and monitoring these species, they're sentinels, so we can monitor the whole food chain as well, and the quality of that food
Yes.
chain. So
Right.
so they do bring masses of conservation benefits. But it's a shame that we have a very I don't like the use of predator or apex predator, but that's scientifically what they are. And there is a very anti-predator attitude here in Wales,
Right.
here across
Right.
Britain. That not so much in Wales, but there are still some landowners with that. I say they're imprinted in their work ethic, because people, it's generational. It's been passed down through
Right,
fathers,
right.
and
Right.
and that's what I
Right.
mean. It's just working with, with providing another way of thinking about these birds, rather than using the derogatory terms of pest, predator, and all of this stuff. So yeah.
Yes, I totally agree, Sophie. You were mentioning about that this behavior is something, they get as part of their generation, like part of upbringing. And it's really important that education becomes an integral component in changing behaviors.
Yeah.
And I totally agree. The creating values for raptors or eagles in general as apex predators, as important component of the ecosystem. And you mentioned earlier, I love that phrase. It's also developing moral obligation, over these species that we basically who suffers, because of human wrongdoing. So that's
Yeah,
the goal.
it's not, it's the moral duty to restore these species, but also restore the ecosystem functions, which are going to provide, like I said, the benefits for a wide array, not only with people, clean air, clean water, they're all linked to this sort of stuff, and so it's restoring those ecosystem functions that we've also been missing for over 150 years.
Yeah. It's just fascinating to hear the things that you said, and it's like we're singing to the same tune, so to speak. It's like it's also what we've been saying here. And so you're saying that using the word predator there is sort of stigmatizing the eagle as like maybe antagonizing them. Is that how it is? So you refrain
I
from
think
using the word
so.
predator?
But
Yeah.
I've found over the last couple of years that even using the words rewilding, for example, is
Mm.
changes. I went through a full hour and a half of a policy meeting without using that word, and somebody come in behind me, and we were just talking about Eagle Reintroductions, and it was such a
Yeah.
respected conversation. And then
Mhm.
somebody done another talk and used the word rewilding, and the whole room and of the dynamics just changed. And it's just
Whoa.
the
Oh
terminology
my gosh.
sometimes that
Yeah.
we need to, that we need to be careful of with public and stakeholder
Right.
engagement. I mean, it seems silly as scientists, these are the go-to terms that we go to in scientific reports, but working with the general public and stakeholders, sometimes they have a really negative attitude, and that's just
Right.
the perceptions that they've built up. Whether that's, I mean, the media doesn't help these days. The media does really put a negative spin on things, and I do really think that feeds into why we're so disconnected from our environment and our wildlife these days, is because
Wow.
of the
Okay.
scaremongering by media. But yeah, so it's just working with what people think about these species, and learning about their
Right. Agree.
connections with rural areas as well, because you can learn from landowners. Is it,
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really also trying to bridge that gap in communication between like science, right, and what people on the street know or understand or what their impressions are. Like in our case here, I wouldn't say that there's that sort of antagonizing effect when we use the word predator when we refer to the eagle, but I find that it's more charismatic to refer to them as our national bird, for
Yeah.
instance, because that draws in more like emotional attachment to to the species rather than saying it's an apex predator. Although we still try to show these different roles that it has actually. Like you were saying, when you say apex predator, it points out to the value that it has in our ecological system, for example. So wow, fascinating. So, Sophie, I want to go back to what you said earlier, about your project, because we're curious about the challenges that you're facing, or maybe challenges that you're anticipating. And, do you think these would be resolved soon, and how would you do it?
I think, to be honest, I think the biggest challenge is yet to come. We've tackled
Mm,
challenges in regards to filling in knowledge gaps. So those have been our main challenges with the feasibility study so far, is filling in those scientific knowledge gaps that we didn't have evidence for. So our biggest challenge was, for the research side of things, our biggest challenge was we didn't have enough evidence in Wales to suggest that they were native and widespread species. So we couldn't go for a reintroduction to restore them into their historic ranges until we knew that, until we gathered evidence of that. We've now got over 151 eagle records across Wales, and Wales is very small geographically speaking. And we started with only 25. So, I mean, we've got enough evidence now to provide that. Another challenge, for example, is another research challenge for us was that we haven't got an active raptor study group. So we've got regional raptor study groups, but we haven't got a national raptor study group like England and Scotland. So normally we would go to them and ask for evidence of, breeding productivity, so we can have a look at ecologically similar species and how they are used in the landscape. But we didn't have that. I mean, but now we've got really, we've looked into that. We've looked at other species, and we're quite confident around that research. Suitable habitats, for example, we didn't know whether this was a feasible option. Now we do. 3 years down the line, we've got all of this. But like I said, I think the biggest challenge is yet to come. I think the greatest challenge of any reintroductions of apex predators is public and stakeholder attitudes. So from our light engagement, there's concerns. So these are the main concerns here in Wales, because they're such a big species. They've especially whitetail seagulls, they've got an 8.5 wingspan, but there's a reason for
yeah.
that. It's because they're soaring birds. They use, abiotic factors really, and those big wings really help them save energy. That's the reason why they're so big. It's not because they're really vicious predators. But the main concern for bringing these birds back in Wales is about children, small dogs, also lambs as well is one of a really active and very, I think, acceptable concern for rural landowners. But with whitetail seagulls, and the media as well, that has put that negative spin, and historically speaking as well, that attitude that they're going to kill
Yeah.
lambs is definitely something that we need to tackle. But evidence for white-tailed eagles, there is no global evidence that shows that they do actively take healthy, viable lambs. Healthy, there's evidence to say that they predate on, lamb carcasses, for example, so already dead carcasses,
Okay.
sick,
Right.
weak, and injured, and very small. So very kind of, small lambs, basically, rather than those healthy, viable lambs. So that reflects their ecosystem functions, because one of the
Yes.
the main ecosystem functions of eagles is to take out the sick, diseased, and injured prey, strengthening those gene pools. So it is down to their instinct really here. So if there's a already dead lamb in a field, for example, a predator is going to use that as free food, and that's where the misconception comes from,
Right. Right.
for white-tailed seagulls in particular. So that's something that there is an active strategy that we will be working with, providing that evidence. And the evidence has come from Norway. Norway holds 60% of our white-tailed seagull populations, and they've had a 33 years of working with farmers, a post-mortem scheme, for example. So if there's a lamb that's passed away, or have been predating upon, they've got very good collaboration with researchers. The researchers will come out, they will do autopsies on the carcasses. They'll find out what predator actually killed the carcass, and then that that helps them manage their land. And over 33 years, there's been no whitetail seagull predations on lambs in Norway.
Wow.
And that's replicated across Europe, really. The only conflict arises when there's compensation schemes in place, believe it or not. So it's very political,
Mm.
very political. So we're hoping to tackle this head on now in Wales in the upcoming year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything
Well,
you'd like to say?
Andy, I'm sure you'll agree that it's also sort of resonates with our
Yes.
challenges.
Yes.
Dealing with human behavior and values that are really
Mm.
complex.
Yeah.
But I do agree that providing scientific facts is one valid way to go. And again, as you've mentioned, Andy, transforming these scientific facts into information that the public can appreciate
Yeah.
and understand. And also, of course, that conservation also clearly benefits many people.
Right.
Yeah, so this is all great. We're learning a lot. Well, really appreciate the conversation. Lots of wisdom and insights. But again, time flies so fast. It's almost an hour. But I think we still have one last question
Mhm.
for both of you, and that would be, Sophie. And this is a very very important question for us. If we are to explore reintroduction as a conservation option for a national bird, what can you recommend to our team? What do we need to prioritize?
That's a good question. From what I've heard today, your profile and your credentials with the community are really positive anyway. So I would say the evidence of strengthening, obviously the monitoring, about the population numbers, like surplus numbers, and really understanding how
Right.
population demographics are working. It's probably the first initiative to really look into. So starting with that biological feasibility of your current population to then drive what strategy moving forward, whether that would be a reintroduction or reinforcement, for example, of those populations. But yeah, and obviously working with stakeholders as well. I think that's
Very important.
important part of any reintroduction program. But I think you do have scope to reintroduce. From what you've said, you've got scope to use as a conservation strategy in the Philippines for this marvelous bird. And and I'm very willing to help you gather that evidence, for example, whether that's the history of the birds, whether that's, habitat suitability, for example, as well, the research behind it. And yeah, so I think, there's a lot of scope to go down that route, and it would really help, obviously, the conservation of your national bird. How about you, Jimmy? How would you think that a reintroduction would help?
So yeah, I completely agree. I suppose it's a two-pronged thing in terms of, I agree with what Chris had said in the previous conversation you've had about getting to grips with the populations that you've got, especially on islands like Leyte, where you don't necessarily know exactly what's going on with the eagles and the populations. But I think another factor is engaging with the younger population as well of people, humans, so children, because ultimately what all the work, whether it's in Wales or Philippines, that you're achieving now needs to be carried on, not just in 5 years, but 10 years, 50, 100 years time. So I think it's really important that you always build into this how we're going to engage with the younger generation, children and young adults. And I think, I know certainly in the UK, but maybe and possibly, I know working with you, Jason, in the Philippines, we've got some wonderful younger adults, teenagers, academics coming out of university, going into university, that have got such a strong interest and drive to make a difference to species like the Philippine eagle and the environment. And often what I find as well, working with younger people, not that I'm saying I'm old now, but what I tend to find is they and Sophie's a great example of this with ERW, is they take an idea or a vision like Roy Dennis gave Sophie back in 2016, and they do something with it. They expand on it and they make it happen. And I think that's really going to be critical for the future of the Philippine eagle in the Philippines, and the eagles in Wales as well, is engaging the youngsters as well, and sort of guiding them with your wisdom, Jason, and all your years' experience.
Yeah, well, definitely that's a recommendation well taken. We're very happy to hear this. We promise, Jimmy, that you'll see more young blood in our program, and then we're looking forward, to more engagement with you both on this particular aspect of our work. So yes, it was really very interesting, a very insightful conversation. And again, I hate to end this, but really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much, Dr. Sophie-Lee WIlliams, and to our reactor, my dear friend Jimmi Hill, for joining us. We look forward to have you here in the Philippines. And again, we'll be definitely in touch with you for more conversations for Philippine Eagle conservation.
Oh, I look forward to it.
Thank you
Thank you
so
for the
much.
Thank you very much.
Wow, that was everything I heard from them. All encouraging on our next steps, for us to take our next steps. Really looking forward to it. But like in anything, I wanted to say kanina na parang in anything naman talaga, I think ang mahirap talaga is when you're trying to change people's attitudes and mindsets, di ba? In anything that you try to do, I think that's really a big challenge. And I mean, it's kind of comforting also to know that we're not the only ones who are going through these sort of challenges. And it's nice to hear a lot of similarities with, Sophie's stories. It's really, and also,
And it's also very nice to hear, from Sophie, even yung mga details ng use of particular words that is appropriate for a particular
I was so interested in that.
Yeah. So it only means that their group is really into finding the right communication tool, and we've experienced that. Remember, Andy, with our indigenous peoples engagement. In the past, we were always talking about critically endangered species, protected bird, protected area, and then we found out that we're using the wrong language. When we started using Osaka, these indigenous perceptions of forest values and eagle values, then we connected with them.
I really personally find it fascinating. That conservation is already a discipline, right? Wildlife conservation, and yet we still use different terminologies across the globe. I mean, we use different words pertaining to certain things because, again, our audiences vary, and then depends on what we're trying to accomplish. So, we definitely have a lot to learn moving forward, and I find that very interesting what Sophie shared about the use of the word predator. And even rewilding. I mean, even in our case, when we would say critically endangered, what does that even mean, right?
True,
I mean, for us, we know 400 pairs left, but what does it really mean to just have 400 pairs left in the wild? So how do you translate that to something that, like you said, the public would appreciate? Like, what does that mean to have just 400 pairs left of eagles in the wild? So I think it's an ever evolving challenge when it comes to trying to use the right words and to communicate effectively. So
it's also a trial and error thing, like
it really is
trial and error, and then working sincerely with your partners and trying to strike a common language.
Yes.
Yeah.
Learning as we
Yeah.
go. Just before we wrap up, we have to say hello to people who left comments over on our Facebook page. Hello to Rika, to Ramesses, Daniel, thank you. To Bam, who's on YouTube, watching us on YouTube, and said this has to be on Spotify under podcast. Very good conversation. I love you guys. Keep it up. Thank you. Wow.
Thank you,
I might
Bam.
consider doing something like that and doing this more regularly. Hi also to Jewel, Julius Ortegas, Tuti. Thank you for giving us your time tonight and listening in on the conversation. And we hope to do this again soon, right?
Yep. This is not our last episode, definitely.
Yeah, we definitely have a lot more that we can talk about and how we can move forward. And this is also our way of getting you watching us right now on Facebook and on YouTube to be involved, and opportunity as well for you guys to directly ask us if you have some questions and all of that. So we would love for this to become more interactive in the future, right?
Yes,
Okay.
I totally agree, Andy. And
Yes. So
see you in our next
yes,
episode. Hopefully next month.
yes. Oo nga. Fingers crossed. So just before we say goodbye, I want to say thank you again to our partners and Rocket Power Corporation, to OmniPay Incorporated for co-presenting the Philippine Eagle Week with us, to Energy Development Corporation, to Ulticon Builders Inc., PLDT, and of course the support of FBC Utilities Incorporated. Thank you again for watching us. Until the next one. Bye.